Hello everyone, welcome to EPG Pathshala. In this video, we'll discuss Module 4, Defining Language. Most people define language as a means of communication. Often, professional linguists also manage to push various dimensions of language under the rug and work with a rather simplified definition of language. At a more serious level, views about language vary from regarding it as a highly rule-governed, complex and homogeneous system to a view which regards language as an essentially fluid phenomena with a high degree of variability built into it. On a different level, there is also the issue of whether humans are born with a mind that should be regarded as a blank slate or with an innate language faculty hardwired into the human brain. In the first case, that is, if humans are born with a blank mind, language acquisition becomes a matter of learning through imitation in society. In the second case, that is, if we have an innate language faculty, society simply acts as a trigger and language structure is already in place. In this module, we will try to see language in a sociolinguistic framework, and we will see how does the process of language acquisition and human interaction show enormous fluidity and variability. So, if you push people a bit harder and ask them to define language, they might turn to dictionaries to see the definition of languages. Dictionaries can now give different definitions for what language is. For example, the Webster dictionary defines it as a systematic means of communication, communicating ideas or feelings by the use of conventionalized signs, sounds, gestures or marks having understood meanings. Advanced Learners English Dictionary version calls language the system of words or signs that people use to express thoughts and feelings to each others. For the Oxford English Dictionary, it is the method of human communication, either spoken or written, consisting of the use of words in a structured and conventional way. Now the question is whether systematic communication is particularly human property or whether it is more widely distributed, and another question that raises is it only really communication with others what is at the heart of a language? Now, language is not just for communicating to others, but we also use language when we think aloud or when we write poetry or even when we talk to oneself, we need language. One way of appreciating what language could be is to examine its different aspects and then arrive at a more wholesome understanding of the phenomena. And that includes structural, psychological and social aspects of language. Let's see, a child of 4 effortlessly acquires such a rich and complex system, using it in a consistent and generative way to understand and produce novel expressions all the time. So, structurally speaking, language is so richly organized at the level of sounds, words, sentences and discourse. And another important fact about language is that it is generative in nature. All human languages work with a finite set of speech sounds consisting of consonantal and vocalic sounds, making infinite number of expressions possible. All languages would find some ways of making a distinction between minimal and verbal aspects and of indicating the relationship between the doer and the action done. Also, all human languages will combine sounds and words in a systematic and not in a random way. All this can be explained in terms of universal grammar. Now, universal grammar, as proposed by Chomsky, argues that all human beings are endowed with a language faculty. We thus come prepared to acquire languages. Since we have the language faculty in us, we are born with it, and since we have the language faculty, we come prepared to acquire languages, and we just need a trigger to unfold the blueprint that is already in place. Now, all human languages, for example, would share certain features. For example, they work with a finite set of space sounds consisting of consonantal and vocalic sounds, making infinite number of expressions possible, and all languages would find some ways of making distinction between nominal and verbal aspects. Also, all human languages share the feature that they can combine sounds and words in a systematic way. Similarly, all of them will function not in terms of individual words but in terms of constituents that tend to honor their internal integrity. So, all human languages share these features because we all human beings are born with a language faculty. As mentioned earlier, all human languages are structured. We may now examine some issues in the structural aspects of human languages. Consider, for example, the level of sounds. In most human languages, most words will follow the canonical syllabic structure, that is an alternation of consonantal and vocalic sounds. For example, English and thousands of Indian languages do not allow more than 3 consonantal sounds at the beginning of a word. Moreover, it is also highly rule governed which consonantal sound would appear in what sequence, and other sequences are simply not allowed. For example, in English, let's say words like spray, structure, screw, splash, string, etc. have 3 consonants in the beginning of the word, which are SPR combination, STR, SK, SKR, SPR, STR. So now all these sounds can form a cluster in English, whereas the combinations of p, s, r, t, s, r, s, k are not possible. Similarly, in Hindi, a word cannot start with a velar nasal. Let's say there is no word in Hindi which starts with the sound ng. So, as mentioned earlier, all languages are structured in level of sound, syntax and discourse. A child is born with the inbuilt capacity to build abstract rules of this kind in English and other languages. In the case of English, it allows only 3 consonantal sounds at the beginning of the word. If there are 3, the first one has to be a s sound, and the second could be p, t or k, and the third can only be y, r, l or v. Moving on, there are equally complex rules at the levels of syntax. Now, languages tend to get hierarchically organized. That is the structure of a sentence. Let's say John is good. The structure of the sentence is John good will depend on the structure of the simpler sentence John is good. Similarly, the sentence the boy is good and is the boy good are grammatically correct, whereas the grammar of English does not allow a sentence like boy the is good. So anyone who knows English, any speaker of English will know that such an expression or such a sentence is not grammatically allowed. However, those working in the formal structural paradigms generally think of languages as a well-formed system in a homogeneous speech community. For example, according to Chomsky, linguistic theory is concerned primarily with an ideal speaker-hearer situation. However, we know that speech communities are not homogeneous, and grammatically irrelevant considerations, variability in linguistic behavior, etc. may actually be fundamental to language and human behavior. So, in such a context, in such a frameworks, a sociolinguistic study of language cannot be done. Similarly, formal linguists generally see language as a formal system involving a pairing of a set of word and rules of syntax. It's not just that all human beings, except a small number with major cognitive deficits, acquire languages to perfection before the age of 4, and all of them also go through comparable stages of linguistic development and sudden language flowering. This linguistic development is not something that happens for the so-called normal child, but all children, be they visually or hearing impaired, they acquire equally complex systems of language. Now, people are prone to dismiss sign language as a set of gestures of the deaf and dumb, but this is so unfortunate because these children are not dumb by any stretch of imagination, and their sign language is as complex and rich and rule governed as any other language like Chinese, French, Sanskrit or English. So, in the course of such a linguistic development, it is normal to make errors. So, a speaker of English and a user of sign language in their linguistic development are prone to make errors. Such errors, however, prove to be necessary in the process of all acquisition. As mentioned earlier, all children go through these stages. And now let's look into this conversation between a child and a mother. The mother asks the child, "Did you say your teacher held the baby rabbits?" And the child says, "Yes, she holded the baby rabbits and we patted them." Now the mother goes on to say, mother says, "Did you say she held them tightly?" And now the child says, "No, she holded them loosely." So here the mother is trying to make the child realize that his usage of the word holded is not grammatically correct. However, the child refuses to notice that and uses the term holded again. So what we understand from this example is that children change their behavior when they are ready to, and not when you wish them or force them to. However, for many psychologists, language was more a matter of learning than acquisition. So for them, there was no unique language faculty already in place, as Chomsky argued. All children, according to them, must first learn to externalize for learning anything worthwhile. So externalization means to have the awareness that an X exists even when X is not there in the immediate environment. So what they say is, if a child has to talk about the topic X, the child has to first externalize and know that the thing X exists. But it does not explain how complex linguistic systems get constituted at an early age. In the case of second and foreign language learnings, even social psychological variables like motivation, aptitude and attitudes could play some role. Vygotsky in 1962 proposed a socially constructed perspective suggesting that a child's mind is jointly constructed through collaborative interaction between the child and adults in a community. So that is, in the zones of proximal development, adults play a central role. That is, they support children when they face problems they can't handle themselves. So Vygotsky proposed a socially constructed perspective, suggesting that a child's mind is jointly constructed through collaborative interaction between the child and adults in a community. Now Sapir had drawn our attention to the centrality of social environment to language learning in 1921. So he said that if we eliminate society, it is possible that humans will learn to walk, but it is certain that they will never learn to talk or communicate to each other. A fully sociolinguistically spelled out perspective on language would include a detailed analysis of the context of situation, persons, places and topics involved, and account for variability in linguistic behavior depending on the horizontal axis of style and the vertical axis of social class. Such a perspective would eventually show how language is constitutive of being human, and how language can only be conceptualized as multilinguality. So as we mentioned in the previous modules, the existed framework of monolithic society was not acceptable, and a new framework was introduced in the field of sociolinguistics, which focused on multilinguality. Now in the coming modules we will discuss more about such frameworks proposed by sociolinguists such as Fisher, William Labov, Pandit, Trudgill, Himes, Gumpers, Lapage, etc. Now before trying to understand language in a sociolinguistic perspective, it is important to understand that there is a universally shared language faculty, and all human beings have a comparable blueprint of universal grammar. So only this hypothesis can explain why there are structural similarities across human languages and why all children become linguistic adults before the age of 4. There is a universally shared language faculty, and all human beings have a comparable blueprint of universal grammar, and it is only the existence of this language faculty that can explain various shared features across human languages. Now in a sociolinguistic perspective, we can say that languages appear to be highly fluid and are eternally in a state of flux. If one end focuses on what remains stable and may therefore be hardwired into the human brain, the other examines linguistic variability and focuses on what humans actually do with language in social interaction. So the sociolinguistic framework suggests that language is always in a state of flux. It is changing constantly because of various reasons such as contact, diffusion and all that. So when a person, when a Hindi speaking person moves to English speaking place, he has to communicate with the English speaking person and has to learn English, and this influence of English can be seen in his speech of Hindi. So the sociolinguistic perspective says that language is constantly in a state of flux and it is highly fluid, and the focus on such a theory can help us in understanding the actual social interaction. Sociolinguistic perspective arose partly because of intense dissatisfaction with existing models which regarded language as a monolithic system, that is one nation, one language, one religion, and such a monolithic system had no way of handling complex multilingual situations. So it is in such a such a context that the need for a different sociolinguistic perspective was asked for, and issues associated with immigrants, newly emerging states, language planning in multilingual settings, communication, tourism, language standardization, language maintenance, language shift, etc. also posed new problems, which is why sociolinguistic perspective arose, and it claimed that the monolithic system or monolithic framework was incompetent. Lepage tried to synchronize the structural and social and psychological aspects of language in his formulation about linguistic behavior. According to Lepage, the individual creates for himself the patterns for his linguistic behavior so as to resemble those of group or groups with which from time to time he wishes to be identified, or so as to be unlike those from whom he wishes to be distinguished, and this can happen in a certain way. So for this to happen, a speaker has to be able to identify groups, and he should have access to them and should have the capacity to analyze their behavior systems, and his motivation should be sufficiently powerful, and he should still be able to change his behavior depending on the motivation. In talking about the patterns for linguistic behavior, Lepage subsumes the structural aspects. The social aspects are shown essential in terms of the groups that constitute the basis for linguistic behavior and identity formation, and the psychological aspects are noticed in all the four riders. So according to Lepage, a person, an individual has to be able to identify the groups, and he has access to them and capacity to analyze the behavior system, and his motivation is sufficiently powerful and either reinforced by or reversed by feedback from the groups as to his being allowed to join. And the fourth one is that he should still be able to change his behavior. Now, according to Lepage, as discussed in the previous module, every individual creates a pattern for his linguistic behavior. So every individual creates a pattern, and they have a distinct pattern of linguistic behavior, and this particular linguistic behavior is either to resemble those of the groups with which he wishes to be identified, or so as to be unlike those from whom he wishes to be distinguished. Now, it is important that we work not with the concept of a language, but with that of a verbal repertoire, which can accommodate the multiplicity of language and their mingling. So, I hope this module helped you in understanding the importance of sociolinguistic perspective that can illumine both ends of language continuum, that is the universal one and the fluid state of language. Thank you.